Hi, my name is Mackenzie Portney, and welcome to my podcast. I am the owner of Politics with Portney, and this 3-episode arc of podcasts are going to be about white privilege. So what I want to talk about is what white privilege exactly is, examples of it, and how I think we need to change it. So white privilege is the societal privilege that benefits people whom society identifies as white in some countries beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, and or economic circumstances. There are lots of people who deny that white privilege exists. I mean, there are no laws specifically discriminating against people of color, but that doesn't mean it still isn't there. So let's break down examples of white privilege that we see in America all the time today. Let's start with this. There are more people of color in jail compared to white people in jail, and for longer periods of time. This ratio just doesn't make sense. It's not because people of color are inherently more just bad people compared to white people. It's the fact that the justice system truly is not just. Black people are more likely to go to jail for nonviolent crimes, drug-related crimes, than white people are. People of color have gone to jail for 3+ years for just possessing marijuana, a drug that should already be legal. And you can check that out on my website. I have an article that I've written about why it should be legal. In general, the justice system is just more harsh towards people of color. People of color are more likely to get the death penalty, more likely to be convicted for crimes they did not commit. So this really needs to change. All of these juries and lawyers and such, they're mostly white, and everyone is a little bit racist. I feel like I'm even a little bit racist. I can acknowledge that. But we really need to put our beliefs aside, whether we're right or left-leaning when it comes to the law, and focus on whether these people really committed the law or if we're just being biased towards or against them because of the color of their skin. Another problem with people of color in prisons and this lack of justice in the system is a classic example of Brock Turner. Brock Turner was a Stanford student who raped a girl, and there were several witnesses. He was charged with 6 months in prison and released after 3 months. 3 months after sexually assaulting a girl. In contrast, and I know this is just one example, but in 1991, a woman had accused men of kidnapping and raping her. All of them were black and went to the police for it. 2 of them were caught and charged with rape, sodomy, kidnapping, and criminal possession of a weapon. The 3rd man was never caught. Some let me get this straight. I am a feminist, and I tend to believe women in these situations. I like to do my research, but sometimes some women lie. 3 to 8% rape accusations are not accurate in their lies, and it's sad. But then again, 67% of instances of sexual assault aren't even recorded. But I do digress. 26 years spent in prison. One of the men spent before a judge was asked to vacate the convictions based on newly discovered DNA evidence and the woman's decision to recant her testimony. The man who was in jail for 26 years said, and I quote, "This wrongful conviction destroyed my life, but I never gave up my fight." This man spent 26 years in prison for sexually assaulting a woman he hadn't assaulted. Brock Turner spent 3 months in prison for sexually assaulting a girl, and it was witnessed. This is unjust. Brock Turner should have been in for prison longer, And these people of color who were charged for rape that didn't actually commit rape were in there for 26 years, and they shouldn't have been there at all. So that's just one example. Next, there's police brutality. Police officers are constantly getting away with murdering people of color, specifically black people. And I'm not saying killing, I'm saying murdering, because the use of force upon these victims are not justified. And it disproportionately happens to these black people. And when unjust force happens to white people, it makes the news. The cop gets fired, and justice tends to be served more often. I'm not saying that 100% of the time justice is served for the white people and not the black people. This is merely a generalization, but it's pretty accurate. We don't hear stories of lawsuits between families of white victims of police brutality and police officers that get dismissed, that don't receive justice. We don't even hear of these cases at all, really, because police officers tend to not use force against white people because they know they won't be able to get away with it like they do with people of color. And I'm not saying that the police are inherently bad and racist, but there are some bad apples out there. There are hundreds of cases out there where police officers think at the time that a person of color is holding a weapon, so then they use force and against them, and they get harmed when it turns out they didn't even have a weapon. But the law says that if the police officer truly believes it at the time, they have the right to use force, even if they're wrong. This needs to change, and I'll get to that later about what I think needs to be done to change this white privilege thing. And I know a lot of this kind of sounds more about racism than white privilege, but our privilege as white people is that we aren't spending as much time in jail for the same exact crimes, and we don't have to worry about police brutality as much as people of color. Another thing is the high poverty rates for people of color. It's not because people of color are inherently lazy and don't work as hard. Since people of color entered the job market, white people have already had an advantage. So from that, people of color were at a disadvantage. And yes, there is a law in which you cannot discriminate based on the race of a person when it comes to hiring. But get this, and I'm going to borrow a statistic from the podcast The North Star, which is by Sean King. It says that a black man fresh out of college is just as likely to get hired for a job as a white man fresh out of prison. A black man fresh out of college is just as likely to get a job as is a white man fresh out of prison. This is disgusting, and this cannot continue. These high poverty rates for people of color also connect to more people of color being in jail. Due to poverty, people often commit crimes. They commit crimes like prostitution and petty theft. And this also accounts for a lot of the more people of color being in jail. But these tendencies don't depend on the amount of melanin you have in your skin, but of your socioeconomic status, which people of color tend to be predisposed to being on the lower side. Furthermore, people of color, and this does not include Asian Americans, from black people to Latinos, make less money per dollar than white people. This includes men and women. In addition to a lot of this, there is a severe lack of people of color being represented fairly in various industries. From political office to the entertainment industry, black people are being underrepresented. They add so much value to this country, yet they're not being properly represented in these industries. Drugs are often a common problem among black communities, and they were kind of ignored. Black people, drugs, it's something that just happens. But since the opiate epidemic has emerged, and the disease of addiction does not discriminate, so many white people have had it that has really become one of the frontline parts of our political climate. People are talking about how to deal with this issue, rehabilitation, decriminalizing drugs from marijuana to all hard drugs. This only emerged once it was affecting mass populations of white people. This is white privilege. What are the other things that aren't affecting white people that are affecting black people that aren't being brought to attention? Now I'm going to get into what I think needs to be done to stop this chronic issue of white privilege. Did you know that you do not have the right to an education? You merely have the right to go to school. And it is clear that the education of black people is simply not as much of a priority as it is the education of white people. Schools that are predominantly white have very high standards for their teaching. Schools that are predominantly black, specifically in inner cities like Chicago and Philadelphia, have very low standards and oftentimes don't even have teachers in class because you don't need an education, you just need to go to school. This lack of education is also what often leads more people of color staying in poverty their whole lives. So legislation needs to be changed, that people need a right to an education, not just to go to school, because then what's the point? Education is mainly done on a statewide basis. So the education for inner city Philadelphia should have the same standards as is for Pittsburgh. But it's not like that, and it needs to be. Another thing, back to police brutality. The only way that police brutality is going to stop is if we hold police officers accountable. Let me tell you a quick story. Eric Garner, a man of color, was on the side of the street and was stopped by police because they thought he did something wrong. He was cooperative and nonviolent, but he was very frustrated because he knew he had done nothing wrong. A police officer attacked him and choked him to death. Keep in mind that the chokehold in the NYPD had been banned for already 20 years. And it was recently decided that this man did not die due to the police officer choking him, and that the police officer just didn't choke him. His murder is on video. This is unacceptable. The mayor won't fire him. The police department won't fire him. This murderer is getting out scot-free. So we need to hold these police officers accountable. It's ridiculous. We need juries with more equal ratios of people of color to white people. We need fair rulings. We can't have these cases dismissed. So many cases of police brutality against people of color are dismissed. They just say, oh, well, we had reasonable cause to think that they had a gun. And sometimes it is justified to shoot someone if they're posing a danger. The thing is, just because they committed a crime or you think they did, doesn't mean they deserve to die. You just need to stop them, and killing someone is not catching them. So I encourage you to research this case of Eric Garner. Research cases around your area with police brutality and racial injustice, and contact your local leaders. Email them, even tweet them, encouraging them to do the right thing, or even just asking them why they're doing the wrong thing. Public outcry is proven to produce results. If we all work together, we can slowly bring down white privilege. It's not going to be easy, but it starts with holding people accountable for racism. We need to encourage people of color not to settle for this world that we're living in today. It's better than 17th century slavery, but we still have such a longer way to go. People of color need to not settle, get educated, let go of that fear, and reach for the jobs they never thought they could have, because they are perfectly capable of achieving them. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I believe that white privilege is real, and I think after listening to this, you will too. Next podcast, I'm going to unpack this issue with someone who does not agree with me on this issue. So thank you so much for listening, and I encourage you again to make the difference you can in your community to ending the chronic issue of white privilege.